What happens after you've stared into the abyss and it blinked? After the dark night of the soul fades and the screaming silence settles in, you find yourself not triumphant, but hollow. Everyone talks about the transformation that comes from confronting your shadow. Few prepare you for what comes next. The haunting quiet, the strange numbness, the disorienting calm after you've burned everything false to the ground. Shadow work doesn't leave you glowing and victorious. It leaves you raw. You've torn the mask off your ego, ripped out the lies you once called love, success, and self-worth. And now, standing in the ruins of your old self, the question echoes louder than ever. What now? This is the overlooked chapter, the morning after the soul's earthquake. You've survived the collapse, but you haven't rebuilt. You're left in psychological limbo, no longer attached to the illusions that once anchored you, but not yet integrated into a new, cohesive identity. And the danger? Most people, unable to bear this ambiguous space, run back into the fire they just escaped, simply because it's familiar. Let's pause here. Not to move forward too quickly, not to patch the wounds with fresh distractions, but to understand what's truly happening in this space, this between self. Because this is where the real work begins. The quiet collapse of meaning. At first, there's relief. You've finally told the truth to yourself. You've stopped pretending. But quickly, that relief gives way to an existential vacuum. The roles you used to perform feel like poorly written scripts. The ambitions that once drove you now seem ridiculous. Even the people in your life feel foreign, as if they're speaking a language you no longer understand. This is the identity withdrawal phase. Like quitting a psychological addiction, your old self screams to be resurrected. It tells you to chase validation again, to armor back up, to smile politely and ignore the ache. But something inside you, now awake, won't let you. And here comes the trap. Because this part feels so lost, so lonely, so useless, you think you failed. But in truth, this emptiness is not failure. It's a sacred void, a necessary death before any authentic rebirth can take place. The urge to return to the familiar. There's a cruel irony here. After all the agony of dismantling your inner illusions, there's a strange longing to go back. The pain you once wanted to escape becomes tempting again, not because it was good, but because it was known. You miss your trauma bonds. You miss your coping mechanisms. You miss the illusion of safety. It's not that you want to suffer, it's that you've forgotten how to live outside of suffering. You begin rationalizing your return. Maybe it wasn't that bad? Or, at least I knew what to expect. This is the shadow's final trick. It doesn't try to seduce you with power anymore. It tries to lure you back with nostalgia. But going back means betraying everything you fought to uncover. It means choosing comfort over truth. It means editing yourself again to fit into spaces that once suffocated you. And your soul knows better now. When the world no longer mirrors you, perhaps the hardest part after shadow work is not the inner shift, but the outer disconnect. You've changed, but the world hasn't. Friends still want the old version of you. Family pretends nothing happened. Colleagues expect you to keep playing roles that now feel like betrayal. This mismatch creates friction. Conversations feel hollow. Social gatherings become exhausting. And the temptation is to either isolate completely or pretend again. But neither path honors your transformation. So what do? You learn to sit in this discomfort. You resist the urge to perform. You practice being real, even when no one claps. You start speaking your truth, even if your voice shakes. Because healing isn't about being accepted, it's about being authentic. Conclusion of part 1. This is the beginning, not the end. Shadow work is not a self-help aesthetic, it's a spiritual surgery. And after any major operation, you don't run marathons, you recover, you breathe, you slowly learn to trust the ground beneath you again. This first stage, this raw, empty space, isn't a mistake. It's not a detour. It's the true path. It's where you get to rebuild, not based on fantasy or fear, but on truth. And that begins by not rushing, not pretending you've figured it all out, but by allowing this strange, beautiful, terrifying space to teach you who you really are, beneath all you've shed. After shadow work, you don't emerge triumphant with a shining new identity. You crawl. You blink in the light like someone who hasn't seen day in years. You try to speak, but forget the language you used to rely on. Politeness, avoidance, the fake smiles that once got you through a room full of strangers. Now, they feel like foreign tools left over from someone else's life. At this stage, the real work begins. Not the dramatic breakdowns, but the small, daily acts of choosing truth over approval. You start to see how deeply your previous self was built on pleasing others, avoiding rejection, and camouflaging pain. It's not glamorous. It's not social media ready. It's quiet, clumsy, and deeply uncomfortable. Because to build a new self, you first have to stop editing yourself for people who never saw the unfiltered version to begin with. Letting go of performative healing. You'll notice something strange. People start praising your healing, but they want it neat. They want a version of your story with a happy ending, something inspiring but not too disruptive, empowering but not too raw. They say things like, "I'm so glad you're better now," as if healing were a destination rather than a practice. But you're not better. You're honest, and honesty looks messy. Performative healing is the socially acceptable version of growth. It sells, it inspires, it fits inside a caption. But real healing is chaotic. It involves relapses into old fears. It includes days where you feel nothing, and moments where you miss the version of yourself who didn't know better. To continue forward, you have to stop packaging your pain for other people's comfort. You learn to resist the urge to be okay, just so others don't feel awkward around your process. Reconnecting with the body and the present. Another piece that returns in the stage, often quietly, is your body. During trauma, the body becomes a battlefield. You disconnect from it. You live in your mind, solving, analyzing, escaping. But now, slowly, you begin to feel again. Hunger, restlessness, emotion in the gut, a lump in the throat, a flutter in the chest when you're near truth. This is terrifying, but it's also progress. Reconnecting with your body means rejoining life. It's an act of reclaiming what was abandoned during the years you survived instead of lived.
If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.
You begin to move slower. You take deeper breaths. You notice the seasons. You begin trusting sensations, not just thoughts, as valid pieces of truth. And perhaps for the first time you realize being grounded doesn't mean being still, it means being present. Losing people you thought were permanent. One of the sharpest griefs in post-shadow work life is the quiet loss of people you thought were forever. These aren't dramatic betrayals. These are slow fades. You speak your truth, and they flinch. You stop playing a role, and they disappear. You grow, and they accuse you of changing, as if staying wounded was a contract you failed to honor. At first, it hurts. It feels like abandonment. But in time, you begin to understand. You weren't abandoned. You simply outgrew dynamics that needed your silence to survive. You stop chasing people who require you to shrink. You stop apologizing for your clarity. And slowly, the grief turns to gratitude. Because now, you're making space for relationships that can meet you where you are, not where you used to be. Conclusion of part 2. You're not broken, you're rebuilding. The second stage after shadow work feels disorienting, not because you're broken, but because you're reorganizing. You've torn down an entire structure, and now you're learning to lay new bricks, one by one, without rushing. There are no shortcuts here. No 7-step plans to a fully healed self. Just presence, just truth, just the willingness to show up, even when it's awkward, even when you don't recognize the person staring back in the mirror. You're not lost, you're becoming. And becoming is not a straight line. It's a spiral, a stumble, a slow return to what's always been waiting beneath the noise, your actual self. Just when you thought the worst was over, something strange happens. You've done the shadow work. You've started telling the truth. You've set boundaries, released old identities, and learned to sit with discomfort rather than run from it. By all accounts, you should feel better, freer, stronger. But instead, there's a new ache rising in your chest, a quiet despair, not born of trauma, but of awareness. This is the paradox of growth. The more awake you become, the harder it is to tolerate anything less than real. Conversations feel hollow. Routines feel lifeless. Even your ambitions, once filled with fire, now seem like echoes from an old version of yourself. And suddenly, you're hit with the terrifying question: if I'm no longer who I was, but not yet who I'm becoming, then who am I now? The emptiness between versions of you. This in-between space is where most people panic. It's the identity void, the shedding of your former masks, without the comfort of a new role to hide behind. You're not performing anymore, but you haven't found a rhythm to replace the performance. You speak from truth, but sometimes that truth feels jagged and uncertain. You crave meaning, but nothing external seems to satisfy the hunger. This is where many turn back, not because they failed, but because clarity can feel like loneliness. The cost of seeing clearly is realizing how much of your old life was built on illusions. Relationships rooted in approval, goals driven by fear, busyness disguising emptiness. You might look around and think, I did all this work for this? But here's what you don't yet realize. This silence isn't a void, it's a clearing. Disillusionment is a sign of maturity. Disillusionment feels like loss, but it's actually a form of wisdom. You're not broken, you're unlearning the fantasies that kept you asleep. You no longer believe every story your mind tells. You question the roles you were taught to play. You don't need to be nice at the expense of being real. You don't chase validation like it's oxygen. This stripping away can feel like death. But it's the death of who you were pretending to be, not who you actually are. True clarity often arrives as grief, not just for the people you've lost, but for the illusions you once needed to survive. And in that grief, something beautiful starts to stir. The desire to live from something deeper than identity. The pull towards solitude and simplicity. You start wanting less, not because you're giving up, but because you're finally full. You crave slower mornings, unpolished conversations, moments of real connection. You choose silence over noise, depth over performance, presence over productivity, and people don't always understand this shift. They'll ask why you're quieter, why you seem distant, why you're no longer interested in the same hustle, drama, or applause. But what they don't see is that you're not disappearing, you're returning, not to who you were, but to what you are when no one is watching. In solitude, you begin to hear the subtle truths that were drowned out by performance. Your body becomes a compass. Your intuition sharpens. Life becomes less about chasing and more about listening. The rebirth is subtle but powerful. This part of the journey won't look dramatic on the outside. There are no fireworks, no Instagram captions that can contain it. But within, a revolution is underway. You're learning to move without striving, to speak without rehearsing, to exist without needing to be more. The self you're growing into doesn't wear armor. It doesn't apologize for needing rest. It doesn't fake joy or feign perfection. It simply is, raw, evolving, and enough. This phase is not the end of the journey, but it marks a profound shift. You no longer measure healing by how happy you appear, but by how honest you're willing to be. You've stopped decorating your cage. Now, you're walking toward the door. What if the version of yourself you've been chasing is simply a mirage? One that vanishes the moment you stop running and stand still. Not everything demands effort. Not every wound begs to be stitched. Some things only find their shape in silence when you stop grasping and start noticing. In this final stage, there's no thunderclap of revelation, no applause. Just the quiet unfolding of something deeply real. You're not aiming to become a perfected version of yourself. You're finally becoming honest with what hurts, with what heals, with what simply is. You look back and realize it wasn't the pain that scarred you most. It was the resistance, the way you tightened every muscle to avoid breaking, the way you kept narrating your story to make it seem like you had already triumphed. But all the while, you were still in the fire. Now, strangely, you welcome the heat. Not to burn, but to melt. Melt into a version of you that doesn't need to be defended, explained, or polished. You let yourself soften. You let yourself shed. You begin to see how much time was spent rewriting the past, editing memories to make them bearable, looping conversations to feel in control, twisting narratives just to survive. But healing is not a literary process. It's a visceral one. You don't need the perfect explanation. You need presence. And presence means letting go of the script mid-scene, letting a story die before it wraps up neatly, learning that sometimes freedom isn't earned through struggle, it's found through surrender. You watch your mind try to leap into the future, reaching for predictions, certainty, outcomes. But this time, you don't follow. You breathe instead. You stay. You allow mystery to sit beside you like a companion, not a threat. There's a liberation in not needing to understand everything. in trusting that not every emotion requires analysis. Not every wound must be dressed. Some things simply ask to be felt and released like waves against a shoreline. Fierce, then gone. You drop the desire to be impressive, to be wise, to be done. You become available instead. Available to the real you. Not the curated version, but the trembling, still in process, gloriously flawed you. Ironically, as you stop searching, the world opens. Not because you finally cracked the code, but because you stopped reciting it. Life begins responding to your stillness, not your hustle. The right people appear, not because you convinced them to stay, but because your authenticity gave them something to stay for. Your energy no longer screams, "Love me." It quietly whispers, "I'm here." And that presence is magnetic. You stop measuring your growth by what you fixed and begin honoring what you've held, what you've forgiven, what you've allowed to be witnessed without judgment. You no longer need to stand on a stage to be seen. You no longer dress up your vulnerability in armor. You let it breathe. You let others see the cracks without rushing to patch them. And in doing so, you become safe, not just to yourself, but to others. You become the friend, the partner, the parent, the stranger who radiates safety simply by being unmasked. You understand now. Your worth was never waiting at the end of some long transformation. It was there, even when you were still tangled, even when you didn't know how to speak your needs, even when you were trying to earn what was already yours. This isn't a return to innocence. It's a return to integration. Not becoming who you were before the wound, but someone who carries the wound and the wisdom together, like flame and smoke, indivisible. You start to live without dragging every ghost behind you. You stop explaining your decisions to people committed to misunderstanding you. You learn the grace of closing doors without bitterness. There is no arrival. There is only this, a quiet, consistent, returning to yourself, again and again, in each breath, in each choice not to abandon yourself. You are not a project, you are a presence. And the more you remember that, the less you chase, the more you attract. The less you grasp, the more you receive. The less you edit, the more you are seen. Eventually, you realize, the life you longed for wasn't waiting at the top of some staircase. It was here, in the unglamorous courage of staying, of feeling, of being. You didn't bend life to your will. You became someone life could meet halfway. You stopped screaming into the storm and learned how to dance in the rain.